The honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I'm very proud to join my colleagues and speak in full support of Bill C-88 today. The Prime Minister has stated that no relationship is more important to our government and indeed to Canada than the one with our Indigenous peoples. I'm proud of what we have done to make this commitment real, and that we're continuing to strive to fulfill it with bills such as the one that we have before us today. Our government is dedicated to a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples in the true spirit of reconciliation. But this requires real work, Mr. Speaker. One of the key elements in achieving true reconciliation is meaningful consultation. Canada is committed to following the principles laid out by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Furthermore, our Constitution protects Indigenous and treaty rights. When those rights may be impacted, Canada must engage in consultation with Indigenous peoples. Mr. Speaker, this isn't an option, it's a legal obligation. And that's only the starting point, Mr. Speaker. We've reached a moment in our country's history where we're making deep, foundational changes to the way that we approach our relationships with Indigenous peoples. These changes must be reflected in legislation that we enact here in this place. The only way forward to build a better future for all is by working together in the spirit of respect, recognition of rights, collaboration, and partnership. We're committed to restoring trust and further strengthening our relationship with our Indigenous partners in the Northwest Territories by supporting the integrated co-management regime for land and waters in the Mackenzie Valley. And that's what we're discussing tonight, Mr. Speaker. We needed to restore this trust after the previous government ignored their duty to consult, and were therefore found to have violated their obligations as partners. We need to ensure that the management of our natural resources is done in a way that respects the inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples. Through Bill C-88, we can ensure sustainable resource development while at the same time also protecting the long-term health and well-being of the environment. This proposed legislation was created in a spirit of reconciliation meant to help to renew the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples in the Northwest Territories through mutual respect and cooperation. It's our responsibility to foster and support meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples in order to reach consensus with governments, with industry, and in fact with all Canadians. This is not always a quick or an easy process, but we cannot, under any circumstances, repeat the harmful mistakes of the past, and that past goes back a long way. For centuries, Indigenous people were ostracized and excluded from decision-making processes. Indigenous governments, leaders, and communities did not have a say in what happened to their people or their traditional territories. We need to change that, Mr. Speaker. This disturbing legacy has held Indigenous people back for far too long. It's excluded them from fully engaging in Canada's economy and sharing in the abundance of our country's wealth, both our natural wealth and our economic wealth, Mr. Speaker. This bill is a small step to give Indigenous groups their voices back. Bill C-88 is a direct response to the concerns of Indigenous organizations and governments respecting the legislative and regulatory framework flowing from their constitutionally protected land claim and self-government agreements. While previous governments ignored these concerns, we know that in working collaboratively, we can reach a better result. Mr. Speaker, the amendments proposed by this bill respect the integrity of the land claim agreements that the Government of Canada and the Government of the Northwest Territories entered into with good faith. We've heard loud and clear from our Indigenous partners that the dissolution of the Gwich'in, Sahtu, and Klinol land and water boards by the previous Conservative government denies Indigenous groups their hard-won rights. This has been stated by the courts. We've also heard from them that this directly contravenes their land claims agreements, which include the creation and management of these boards. Reconciliation is not an empty word to our government, Mr. Speaker. Actions must follow words in order to move forward and work towards real and lasting positive change in the relationship between Canada and our Indigenous peoples. This bill proposes to reverse board restructuring and reintroduce the other regulatory amendments. Simply put, Indigenous peoples have the right to oversee how their lands are used and to share in the wealth. These amendments will result in a better process for all parties involved. It will remove uncertainty for groups from the mining, oil and gas industry and other investors wanting to begin new projects in these areas. And Mr. Speaker, business needs certainty in order to move forward. They don't need to know that things are going to change on the road ahead. We need to do the work up front to make sure that all areas are covered. Bill C-88 will integrate the perspectives of Indigenous peoples into the future usages of land and water on their territories. It will include and incorporate Indigenous views and perspectives into any decision-making in regards to land and resources. We must work together in order to improve the quality of life for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And key to achieving this goal is Indigenous control over Indigenous lands. In order to protect the integrity of our land claim agreements and treaty rights, the importance of engagement and consultation must be respected. The Gwich'in, Sahtu, and Mackenzie stood up and made it clear that they wanted their voices heard and their rights acknowledged and respected. This bill will ensure that they will continue to have a say in what happens to the lands and water that they preside over and have presided over for centuries. True reconciliation cannot occur until Indigenous governments and organizations are fully included in the management of land and resources in the North. We need to bring the voices of Indigenous peoples into this process in order to have a broader and more complete view of the future of Canada's natural resources. As the Prime Minister has said, together we can build a world where the rights of Indigenous peoples are respected, where their voices are honored, and where their communities thrive. The bill that we're debating today ensures that the unique perspective of Indigenous organizations, leaders, and communities are heard and listened to. I urge all my colleagues today to recognize the importance of incorporating an Indigenous perspective into the future decision-making of our natural resources sector and to support this important legislation. Mr. Speaker, it is a new way of looking at things. We are changing the order of how we work together with Indigenous people, and that really involves a new way of approaching legislation such as we see in C-88. It also includes some painful redoing of legislation that didn't meet the mark of our future relationship, respecting the rights of Indigenous people. And that's where we find ourselves today, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-88 is taking us down a new road with our northern Indigenous neighbours. It's a road that's going to be good for them, it's going to be good for us, it's going to be good for the land that we all share. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well done.